movement, very similar to the Iranian Revolution. And it was quite encouraging that, in fact, Ikhwan put out a statement directly negating what Khamenei had said and pointing out that this is an Egyptian movement in which Christians and Muslims are participating shoulder to shoulder. However, that said, one should not underestimate the enormous complexity of this transition from the present state of affairs to a democratic system. And I believe that, or let me put it this way, that I'm equally concerned about the role of the military in this. Not only the Ikhwan, but an arrangement in which the military would once again maintain its position of dominance over the civilian government. Therefore, it seems to me that the concerns about the fragility of democracy and the potential for this to go in the wrong direction are entirely justified. And I believe that the focus really should be on the domestic events inside Egypt at this time, and a better understanding of the various forces that are involved.
Now, what would it take? Right.
Transition is going to.
Now, what would it take for that to happen? Do you think, Jim Norekas, in New York with FAIR? Do you think it would make a difference if, for example, the correspondents that the U.S. mainstream media use are from the country in question, the analysts are from the country in question? I saw a story about how American networks had flown in some of their big names, but as soon as things got tough, they were able to get out, to parachute out immediately.
Well, it is a very tough situation where journalists, both domestic and foreign, are being targeted by the regime. So I think the people who are on the ground there reporting are very brave. It's an act of courage. I think that I have a lot of respect for the on-the-ground reporting on this story. It's really the analysis and the coverage, the political coverage in Washington that I think is the big problem here, because it is holding to this very fundamental myth in U.S. media that U.S. foreign policy is primarily motivated by promotion of democracy, and that has been a myth for decades in our media, and there's really very little evidence to point to where the United States has supported a democratic movement when it did not see that as being directly promoting its national interests.
You've got to admit, haven't you, Charlie Wolf, that it's coming as a surprise to many American viewers, isn't it, at this time, to hear that President Hosni Mubarak has been in power for so long. After all, he's been a friend of the U.S. for so long.
Well, again, I go back to what I said earlier. You know, you can have a view of utopia, and you can have a view of reality. America has always stood for freedom and democracy, but you just can't go into every part of the world changing it. It has to come well up from within, and America is there to help. What you can do is to try and work with nations. But how can you say it has stood for freedom and democracy when it's been supporting an oppressive regime like the one of Mubarak's? And that's become starkly obvious in the last few days. Well, again, what happens is what you try and do is work with countries. You know, countries are still self-determinant. You can try and support opposition parties where possible. But you also can try, say, for instance, a good example would be China, calling them out on human rights violations, working with them, trying to get them to slowly move over. And then, of course, when a democracy movement is there, you're there to support them. I think one of the important things as far as Egypt is concerned, just to dovetail off some of the things the professor was saying a couple moments ago, it's not just about elections. I think what's important here is the promotion of freedom and liberty. We really have to work with the Egyptians now in establishing things like rule of law, freedom of speech. But don't you think it looks somewhat hypocritical for the American administration to be talking about? Can I jump in here?
Go ahead, Mr. Norekas.
The United States, the plan that the United States is promoting, as our media is reporting, is to have Mubarak replaced with Omar Suleiman, who is the head of the intelligence service of Egypt. This is not promoting democracy. This is maintaining tyranny. This is the guy who is the boss of the people who are capturing reporters and taking them to torture centers. There was a very gripping account of what it's like inside the secret police's torture centers in the New York Times. You should read that. But when you're reading it, you think to yourself, the boss of these people is the guy that the United States wants to put in power in Egypt. And that is a disconnect that really is not acknowledged anywhere in the U.S. media, that this is in the short term. Go ahead.
In the short term, you're trying to prevent chaos from breaking out. Lawlessness is no help either. You know, it's unfortunate, but there are situations where, as the realist school would say, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB. Now, I'm more of the neoconservative bent, who, going back to the Bush agenda, said freedom is universal. But again, I don't want to see what is a nascent move for democracy being replaced with another tyranny that's just as bad, if not worse, and that, of course, is being the Islamization of Egypt. And that does, and there are strategic interests that come into that vis-a-vis our allies in the region, especially Israel, and also for the people of Egypt. I don't want to see them go from what they've had, which is not so good, and I agree with you, into something that's even worse. I would rather see being able to work with them, again, to put those important institutions in place, and then holding an election, and then seeing a democracy grow and flourish.
All right, we've only got 3 minutes left. I can see you smiling, Professor Benouazizi.
I feel that the United States is in a reactive position at this time. The United States did not put Mr. Soleiman in power. I think you're talking about the Egyptian elite as though they were pawns in the hands of the United States. Both the movement and the reaction to the movement was principally initiated by Egyptians themselves. And I think we would be remiss in emphasizing the role of the United States at this time and losing sight of the enormous problems that the Egyptian society and polity are facing in trying to bring this transition to democracy. And I believe that the United States would have no choice at this time but to respect the will of the Egyptian people and whatever arrangements are worked out there. And over the past week or so, we see a gradual movement by the U.S. administration, and it's very important to point out, in one voice, unlike the reactions to the Iranian Revolution that essentially broke up the U.S. administration back in 1979. In one voice, the U.S. administration has been trying to bring about this process of reconciliation in Egypt. Right. And the main actors are Egyptians themselves.
We don't have very much time. I'm going to ask for a comment from Mr. Wolf and then Mr. Norekas, if you don't mind waiting just a second. Isn't that a good point, Mr. Wolf, that isn't it clear that from the last few days we've seen that given the choice between what they've known and the unknown, the Egyptians themselves have chosen the latter?
Oh, yes. And again, it is up to the Egyptians. That's the whole point about freedom and democracy, is that it is being self-determinant. So again, what we are striving for and what we have stood for, again, is to see that. You can't, unfortunately, snap your fingers, as I think Mr. Norekas may want to do at times, and make it happen. Right. But where it does happen, and then you want to support it. And
finally, Jim Norekas in New York.
Clearly, the United States clearly does not have the ability to dictate events in Egypt, but it is doing its best to determine the course of events. It has an idea of what it wants, and I think that the United States, the public in the United States, is not getting a clear picture of what the United States agenda for Egypt is, and the Egyptian people will have a much better chance of being able to determine their own fate if the United States public is informed about what their government is doing.
Thanks very much indeed to our guests. In New York, Jim Norekas. In London, Charlie Wolf. In Boston, Ali Benouazizi. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. A reminder that we welcome your comments and suggestions via email. You can send them to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.
Al Jazeera is now streaming live to your iPhone, bringing you the news as it happens.
Welcome to the News Hour, live from Doha. I'm Rida Fakhri.
To download, visit the App Store on your iPhone. See the world in real time.
Home to a diversity of rare species, Latvia's pristine woodlands are a place of magic. But with a strained economy and an eager market, forests are rapidly perishing, and with them their inhabitants. People and Power investigates how 60% of Latvia's timber ends up on UK shelves with a questionable seal of approval. Latvia's pulp fiction, at this time on Al Jazeera.
As China undergoes profound changes,